You are listening to episode 83 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Owen Flanagan speaks with us about his new book, The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized. It's not very often that I get a series of emails, Facebook messages, and even tweets about a new book that's just come out, but recently that did occur. And because this is really a podcast for you, I listened, got the book, and the author has turned out to be not only generous with his time, but a terrific interview. So please do keep letting me know, as many of you do, about things you would like to hear about and people you would like me to interview by clicking on the contact button on the website, sending me a message on Facebook, or using that new Twitter account I have set up, @SecularBuddhist. This book particularly interested me because of the author's merging of a comprehensive philosophical view with the underlying naturalism that must underpin how such a philosophy manifests in, say, neurological studies. There is a recognition that we are material beings in the universe, and that some interpretations of Buddhism are very stable and effective without reliance on the supernatural. Owen Flanagan is a James B. Duke Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. He is the author of The Bodhisattva's Brain, Consciousness Reconsidered, and The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Dunn Brothers Infinite Black. And our guest today is Owen Flanagan. Owen, thank you so much for being here.
Very happy to be here, Ted. Thank you.
Now, I was very excited to get to arrange this interview because I've never had quite so many people email me and send me messages and, and notes on the Facebook page for the podcast about your book, The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized. And I think there are a lot of listeners who I think are also followers of Sam Harris, and I know he recommended your book, and that's probably where a lot of the attention came from. So thank you very much for talking with me today about it. What I'd like to do is start with a question about just what your background is and how you became interested in Buddhism.
Great. Well, like a lot of things in life, this was serendipitous, but I had read, I was in college in the late 60s, and like a lot of other people, I was reading people like Alan Watts and Suzuki, but I never, I didn't have much more interest or exposure to Buddhism than to a lot of traditions outside my own, which was Roman Catholic. Although by the time I was in university, I was lapsed. But I was curious about Buddhism, and I was very interested in religions of the world. I guess one thing to say about myself is that I although I was not religious after a fairly young age, in a traditional sense, I've always been interested and respectful of the great world wisdom traditions, is the way I usually refer to them. But So that was then, and things percolated. I never had any experience in meditation, nor did I know anything in depth about Buddhist philosophy. Although I always kept an eye out of the corner of my eye was always focused on Buddhism, because I knew that in some sense of a creator God, there wasn't one within the Buddhist tradition. And I thought that was really interesting, that there could be something like a spiritual tradition or a religion without a creator God, since a lot of Westerners would just say, well, that's impossible. It's not a religion if it doesn't have one of those.
Yeah.
So that was really it. But then in 1999, I was down in Costa Rica, where I used to go some summer times to work, and I got a phone call from my secretary at Duke, saying that the Dalai Lama's people had gotten in touch with me to see if I could come the following spring for a discussion of what turned out to be a discussion of destructive emotions. And I guess the reason for that had nothing to do, of course, because I had no Buddhist cred.
It's tricky for us to get street cred and not
Exactly, that's right.
Yeah.
It was just that I had written a book in the early 90s about consciousness and the nature of consciousness. And I was very much one of the basic principles was that in addition to looking at how the brain works, one should pay attention to what people say about the phenomenology or the experience of consciousness. And so someone on the Dalai Lama's team over there thought that this was congenial. It was a way to make to think about the mind brain in a unified way that could take advantage of, on the one side, that the Buddhists could take advantage of the fact that people in the West were starting to think that we needed to focus on the experience of consciousness, not just on what the brain's doing. And so I was invited to Dharamsala with 5 or 6 or 7, I forget how many of us there were. They called us all scientists. And this was to a mind and life meeting. The Dalai Lama has always been interested, you may know this, in science. And so I was invited over to this meeting, and it was at that meeting in Dharamsala where I was with a bunch of people who became good friends, who were neuroscientists. Richie Davidson is one, Paul Ekman is another, and they were interested in starting to do, or to further the program of doing some empirical work, studying the good effects of Buddhism, Buddhist meditation in particular, on positive mental states and as a way of overcoming destructive mental states. So that really was it. And then what happened then was that I just got really, really curious, both about, as a philosopher of the mind, could neuroscience vindicate the claims of a spiritual tradition on the one side? And on the other side, I got really curious about Buddhism as a philosophy. So I started to study Pali and Sanskrit. I started to try to work at least as a interested observer on a meditation practice. And so that was the beginning. And I started to be asked to write and speak about some of the science of meditation studies. That really is the story. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the book that you mentioned a moment ago is one that led in part to some of the material that, because you refer to it in the Bodhisattva's brain, and you also have the really hard problem, meaning in material world. So this has been an ongoing theme and something you've been dealing with. So you have the nature of consciousness. There are also other books, narrative and consciousness. So you've been tackling this for a while.
Right.
What are some of the themes that have really stood out for you as you try to resolve this, how we look at consciousness in a neurological sense and how we look at it in a philosophical sense? Right.
Well, many people think that the sort of when you go to a bookstore, Ted, it can be funny. If you go to a bookstore outside of a university and you say, where's the philosophy section? they send you down to, a section on the occult.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
so, and we professional philosophers kind of, we get the chills at that point. But the the there's a tradition in 20th century philosophy. Well, now we're in the 21st century, but when I was brought up in graduate school in the 70s, there was a strong tradition that had come over to America from actually from people called positivists in Europe. And the positivists were mostly, well, many of them, let's put it that way, were the positivists were people who were in Berlin and Vienna. So there's a famous circle called the Vienna Circle. And these people, many of them were Jewish intellectuals who felt that they were persecuted and prosecuted, among other reasons, because there were no intellectual standards on what kind of gobbledygook and bullshit and vicious ideologies could be promoted by people. And that part of the problem was really that, so the idea was that many of Hitler's ideologies were just sort of made up out of thin air. And so what the positivists pushed for, and many of them came to America because they were Jewish expatriates, was the idea that one of the roles of philosophy was to try to help people develop views of the world that were consistent with our best knowledge. And in many cases, that meant being consistent or continuous with scientific knowledge. So starting probably in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, at least Anglo-American philosophy in particular, became much more interested in, there's a philosopher who I love, Wilfrid Sellars, who says, philosophy is the discipline of thinking about how things conceived of in the widest possible sense hang together in the widest possible sense. So, so the way this all works is that I was always interested in this question of how to make what I call the scientific image of persons consistent with the humanistic image of persons. And that's the way I started. So the way of thinking about consciousness as the center for the meaning of my life, the significance of my life, for my being a responsible agent in the world, my loves, my passions, my hates, my resentments, and so on the one hand, and thinking about my mind as and my body as explicable by roughly Darwinian theory plus neuroscience. And how do I make those two mesh and reconciliate? So my one really, I was going to say really popular. I didn't mean really popular in the sense of it sold millions of copies. I mean that I wrote it for a more general audience, is called The Problem of the Soul, Two Visions of Mine and How to Reconcile Them. And it's about, so I'd say that is one way to think of my guiding question, how to take the picture of a person as a piece of meat, basically one mammal among bazillions of other mammals, and at the same time as a center of subjective consciousness, where the meaning and significance of life and morality depend upon how you live as a internal or spiritual person. So that has always been the guiding principle, and I have some ideas about how to do that. Although, and that's what I've been writing about pretty much the whole time. So I saw Buddhism as a beautiful sort of possibility proof of a rich spiritual tradition, which for 2,500 years, going back to Abhidhammas, had been focused on developing a really, really rich phenomenology of experience. There's no better text than ancient classical Buddhist texts on taxonomizing mental states in terms of their content and their sources and their objects and things like that, on the one hand. And then we in the West are better, not for any special reasons, except that's the way things developed, at now getting down to the nitty-gritty of how the brain works, how the neurochemistry of the brain works, how different parts of the brain do different things. And so my project has just always been to sort of see if I can bring those two together. And so that's kind of what the project has always been. I sometimes say, if people ask me what I work on, I say mind, morals, and the meaning of life. And the three M's. That's easy for me to remember. And so I kind of just go to whatever wisdom traditions, get my attention up, and then I look at how psychology, brain science, the other social sciences help us understand these other traditions and how these other traditions help us understand what's going on in neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. It's always fascinating how there could ever be the concept that they can't or somehow shouldn't mesh, that we need to distinctly separate our philosophical views and our attitudes about our passions from the neurology that may be underlying them. How could they not be related?
Exactly. That's right. Exactly. So this is, and another way to put your excellent point is just what the heck would we be looking for in the brain if we didn't already know what our loves and passions and hates and experiences were like? Exactly. So this is an important thing. Of course, the place that they do come to clash is when the humanistic or spiritual traditions start to make claims about, for example, such things, and this gets us closer to the book topic, is such things as the soul or afterlives or spirits and ghosts and gods and that sort of thing. And that's, of course, where in our culture people talk about the conflict between the two when there are truth claims about that are significant about the nature of persons.
Right, and ones that are what, as someone who is active in the skeptic community, I always return with the question, it's fine to believe that. I understand you do, and I respect that. What I need to know is, because I don't understand it, please show me what your evidence is for having drawn that conclusion.
Exactly.
And usually the response is just they quote their spiritual text again. Like, well, that's not evidence because there's another book that says the opposite.
That's right.
Pretend I'm from the outside. I don't know. How would I, as a sincere seeker, I'm genuinely interested, and I do want to understand,
right?
Help me get there. And it usually boils down to, well, I have faith.
That's right.
And that's the magic get out of stupid card that
right.
gets used
right.
to excuse a host of things that just, they don't make sense. And I have to say, well, so you believe in levitation? Like, well, no, I don't. That's okay. So there's some criteria by which you look at your claims in your overall religion, and there's some things you already are saying, no, that's bogus.
Right.
How are you making that distinction between that and, say, rebirth?
Exactly.
And that's always an interesting topic of conversation.
Yes, that's right.
That's
right. Right. Well, I agree with you totally about that. I mean, the and my attitude has changed about this, but I like the way you put it. I mean, when people ask me, like last night, I was in a dormitory. Students had asked me to give what they're calling the last lecture. This is based on this. There's a gentleman I read about this. I don't know if I know the details, but professor of maybe computer science at Carnegie Mellon found out that he was dying, and he gave apparently a beautiful class, and he gave some wisdom to the youth. So the students often ask me questions like how they'll ask me things about, are you really an atheist? And I try to explain that, I'm an atheist, not in the sense that I would rule out any possible evidence that could be produced for the existence of some God or other, but I think either Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins talks about kind of a serial atheism and how we're all atheists with respect to some of the great world spiritual traditions. So none of us believe in the gods of the Greek gods, and then others of us will doubt the Hindu gods, and then others will, and some of the Hindus will doubt the Abrahamic gods, and so on and so forth. And my view has always just been, since I was a little boy, yes, just like you said, bring me the arguments, bring me the evidence, and then one by one, I'll just say, well, I just don't see that the evidence stacks up such that I should believe it. So that just makes me, and it does seem they're more responsible than being what people call an agnostic, because I'm actually saying I really pay attention to the evidence you bring, and so far I don't see sufficient reason to believe in what you're positing as real. I don't fuss over it anymore in the way people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and even my good friend Dan Dennett seem to fuss over it, because I've come to the view that as long as a tradition doesn't want to take action towards other people based on their beliefs, I kind of think it's sweet and dear, and I'll leave it alone.
Yeah, I've gotten to that same place where it's a matter of if it positively impacts your life if it is something that you find uplifting.
Right.
I don't see the harm in that. And one of my friends is the fellow who's put together the site whatstheharm.net, in which, they go into questions. But here's the really evil things in that well, sure, we can find that, but you need to understand that not everyone is an adherent of a spiritual tradition in the way that you're focusing on, and that there are other ways to positively engage with things that
That's
we
right.
find uplifting.
Yeah.
And to say you can't do that is like saying you shouldn't like milk chocolate. You should like dark chocolate instead.
No, that's a nice example. I mean, there's an interesting debate about this. Like, as you know, like Sam Harris, after he wrote The End of Faith, then in the Letter to the Christian Nation, he basically argued that people who have the attitude that you just expressed and that I agree with are kind of modelly coddling, people who are moderates who therefore support the nut jobs who go out and do terrible things. I'm not so sure about that. And it's hard to gather empirical evidence here. I was at a conference last year, and I'm writing a chapter right now it was on religion and tolerance. And the question was whether religions engender tolerance or don't. And of course, it's almost an intractable problem because we don't have the world in which there weren't religions. But I am writing, I call it The View from the East Pole, and I'm writing some about the reasons why in both Buddhism and Confucianism there looks to be some more tolerance than in the Abrahamic traditions. But it's a difficult thing to provide evidence one way or the other. But I tend to take the attitude that you have no harm, no foul.
Yeah, we don't have a control group. Unfortunately, we don't have a planet of
right.
non-religion. And I know a lot of people would like to see that, and that's okay.
Right.
That's something they can be passionate about as well.
Exactly.
But I'm with you. I disagree with Sam on that point that positively engaging in dialogue does not make one an accommodationist. It makes one an adult.
Yeah, no, that's a nice way to put it. I agree. Yeah, that's right.
Now, I wanted to ask you about just a little bit about your book, The Really Hard Problem, the Meaning in a Material World, because I think that's where you really flesh out this, and forgive me if I mispronounce that, this eudaimonics?
Yeah, eudaimonics, right.
Tell us about that.
Okay. So here's how I sort of envisioned my project in the last 10 years, because The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World came out in 2007, and then this book, The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized, came out just a few weeks ago. So here was the situation, as I understood it for a long time, that the two major objections to skeptics or to non-believers that I've experienced from students and from public audiences who ask me to speak is that if you are a skeptic or an atheist, then there are two problems. One is the problem that you have no answer to the question, why be moral? You can't be trusted with my sister or my money.
Right.
I have to watch my back when I'm around you, and so on and so forth. That is very, very common view. And we see it in people, great Western thinkers like Dostoevsky, says if there is no God, then everything is permitted. And Nietzsche worries about this, that people, if they come to be skeptics or to think that there is no creator God, nihilism will break out. We won't know how to find our bearings for a long time until we become strong again. So that's the question. There's no motivation to be moral, that worry. And then there's another whole big question is that atheists or skeptics don't have anything upbeat and truthful to say about the meaning of life. That we could say truthful things, but it's very depressing, or we could say upbeat things, but they're not true. And I realized that partly in the course of my own personal journey, I had come to be quite comfortable with my skepticism, agnosticism, atheism, and neither one of those things seemed to be problems anymore. So I guess what I wanted to do was to lay out an argument or two about how it was possible to find meaning in a material world. Now, the reason I choose, and that's what I try to do in both books, I think, the reason I choose this word eudaimonia is that Aristotle, back in the day, 2,500 years ago.
That takes me back, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He says, when I go, he wants to figure out, and this is in a book called The Nicomachean Ethics, he says, I want to figure out what is the highest good? And he says, when I go around Athens or ancient, all over Greece, actually, he says, and I ask people what they want, that they want for its own sake, not for instrumental reasons, like money. Who would ever want to have money in their pocket if it was not instrumentally good, right? He says people all use the same word, and the Greek word is eudaimonia, EU, which means like happy, as in euthanasia, happy death. Daemon, spirit. Everybody uses that same word, he says, but they mean different things by it. So some people think it has to do with political power. Some people think it has to do with reputation. Some people think it has to do with sex, drugs, rock and roll. Some people think it has to do with, this, that, and the other thing. And he says, but what they all seem to share in common is that they like this word. And he says, one of the things that everybody seems to say is that no one would ever choose to live a life without friends. He says that's one unifying feature of it. Anyway, so I like this word from Aristotle because it's not completely subjective. In fact, he says you can't tell if a person is eudaimon even when they die until you see how the grandchildren turn out, which is kind of interesting, right? Because it means that there's that the meaning and significance of a person's life has to do with the effects he or she leaves, the downward, and of course this is, you can still see how I'm getting towards Buddhism. It's sort of like the karmic effects of your actions have some significance for how your life is evaluated after you're gone. So my thought about this was that this is a nice word because it's not the same as the word happiness. And I often say to students, I said, well, everybody in America thinks happiness is the main thing, but was Buddha happy? Was Jesus happy? Was Confucius happy? Was Mother Teresa happy? Was Martin Luther King Jr. happy? Was Sojourner Truth happy? And they all kind of scratched their head and they realized, well, either they don't know the answer or they realized they probably weren't happy in one sense of happy, but they were good people. They would live meaningful lives. So my focus has been sort of trying to say, first pass, if you're looking for meaning, significance, and purpose, then happiness isn't the only thing, but something bigger than that. And that each spiritual tradition, whether it's Buddhism or Aristotle's philosophy or Kant's philosophy or Roman Catholicism, has a somewhat different picture of what counts as a purposeful or meaningful life. At the same time, there's lots of convergences. So one of the things, especially in so what I call eudaimonics is an attempt not to talk about, it's an amalgamation of what some psychologists would call positive psychology. But the idea is to choose a word that gestures in the direction of something like fulfillment or flourishing, and then allows each tradition to speak for itself about what it counts as flourishing. And so that's the project, to figure out what different traditions promise as their goal or end, look at the similarities and differences, and so that's the focus.
It's interesting. It touches on two things you brought up that I want to talk about briefly. Is that in the book you have a way of distinguishing the different content of happiness with superscripting. So you have happiness Buddhism or happiness sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it's a nice scientific shorthand way of referring to what we've all really understood, that a happiness of someone who is addicted to meth is a very different kind of happiness than someone who's in the bliss state of the jhanas.
Exactly.
And so that's a nice shorthand way of describing that, but it also leads into what you've said in brain studies, is that one of the challenges they have is content. We may be doing brain scans on those two different people and have the same areas lighting up.
That's right.
Lighting up for entirely different reasons. Tell us a little bit about that. Let's dig in there.
Okay, so good. So that brings me to sort of how I then got into being a gadfly or a skeptic or a critic about some of the meditation studies that are widely believed in, and a lot of people who do meditation take for granted as having been vindicated. So what happened, I'll just tell a little bit of history. So after those meetings in Dharamsala, there were several studies, actually with very small samples, like Matthieu Ricard, who you may know, he's the Dalai Lama's French interpreter, a great guy, very wonderful person. Richie Davidson and Paul Ekman had Matthew come over, and he went to Berkeley in Wisconsin, and they did some brain scans while he was meditating, and Matthew lit up very, very strongly on the left side of the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is a marker. It had been known antecedently that the better a person's mood is, in some sense of positive mood, would get more left frontal activation and less right side. So roughly, you might say, in a population, the more right-sided in the part of your brain right up by your forehead, the more unhappy or depressed or less positive you were, and the more left side, the more positive. So Mathieu showed up as being very happy, not surprisingly if you know him, and then immediately the word got out, and I don't think anybody did this intentionally, but the word got out that Buddhists were the happiest people in the world. It's like the Barbra Streisand song, right? Mm-hmm. And I was called upon to by the New Scientist magazine, by Australian Public Radio, by Canadian Public Radio. I mean, I forget. It was my 5 Warhol minutes of fame because I was associated with the study, and I was asked again and again why Buddhists were the happiest people in the world, and I kept saying to these interviewers, well, there's no evidence that Buddhists are the happiest people in the world. There's evidence that Matthieu Ricard he lights up strongly on the left side of his brain. And so the first thing I realized is that the public demand in America for anything that makes you happy is incredible. We grasp at it. Boy, is there a market for that? And of course, some people think when the Dalai Lama wrote his book, The Art of Happiness, you may have met many people who say this. They say Buddhism has nothing to do about happiness. It has to do about ending suffering.
Right.
Now, that's controversial, but so some people think, oh, well, the Dalai Lama himself is just a cash cow trying to, market his product to an American audience who only wants this one thing. In any case, so I thought as a philosopher of science and mind, there was reason for caution here. The results were being overblown, not by Buddhists trumpeting these results, but by the audience, the public really taking this in. And as you said, the problem of content is this. Hugh Hefner might score exactly the same way in terms of leftward motion. And not to pick on Hugh Hefner, but I just want to make it, it helps people fix their mind on what the content of the happiness is. I mean, if Hugh Hefner has content to his concept of happiness, it's about sex, drugs, rock and roll in some sense, or whatever an 80-year-old man's version of sex, drugs, rock and roll is, right? And that's got to be very different from what someone like a realized Buddhist adept has as its content. So this is the first problem with brain markers. They're not fine-grained enough to select out these different contents. So that was one of the big problems. The other problem was that, and this is what I do in the book with what you refer to, the superscripting technique, is that different theories promise different types of different feeling states. So, a blissful state is different from a serene state. A state where you're focused on, you're happy because you feel in touch with a omnipotent creator God is different from a mental state where you don't even believe in that sort of creator God, but are also in a positive mental state. So so many of my cautions are about the current state of neuroscience, which, although the brain is the most popular organ right now, it's being overemphasized. We don't know that much about how it works, and the whole body is important, and it's the whole body in the world that's important.
Right. That's a discussion I often have with my skeptic and atheist friends. Is I use the term mind, and as somebody who's been studying Buddhism and those old texts you were mentioning from the beginning on the mind states and all that.
Right.
I know what I mean, and it is very ambiguous to them, but it's not to me because I know it is inclusive of brain and the rest of the body and my interactions and my subjective states. And that's, anytime we look at just brain, we need to understand, as you did with those journalists, is that, well, this is not a study of all of it. This is just this one guy who is showing areas of his brain lighting up.
That's
what
right.
That means within our entire framework is it's just this guy. It doesn't necessarily
Right.
apply
That's
to
right.
anyone else.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and the other thing that I was struck by, I mean, this is again just a sort of more about what I call neurojournalism or popular science or spirituality in science, was I couldn't get people to realize that, I mean, these are the journalists, that if there are these effects of meditation, first of all, there are bazillions different kinds of meditation, as you know.
Right. Right.
And I need to know, like, what kind are they talking about? And secondly, really, what are the effects? So very often what would happen is that, well, and I even would say to people, I said, this hasn't been controlled. We don't know if it's because, if you're finding these results, is it because of meditation? Is the meditation actually way upstream in the causal consequences? I mean, maybe it takes commitment to a certain form of life. Maybe people are predisposed to be in that form of life, and so on and so forth. But the thirst for this kind of quick fixes is, as usual, I think, just a problem in our culture, and and it feeds into the fact that there are, of course, many Americans who do know nothing about Buddhist philosophy and think that when you ask them what they are and they'll say they're a Buddhist, all they mean is that they have some kind of sitting meditation practice, and they don't know anything else. And it's a kind of narcissism, of course. Every tradition has its narcissists, but one worry is that it encourages people to just find another form of narcissistic activity, and they don't understand the overall Buddhist philosophy or the moral vision associated with it.
Yeah, I always get a little twitchy when someone asks, and it's not to dissuade anyone from having these thoughts that are going to come up. I sometimes get notes, how do I become a Buddhist?
Yeah, that's
and,
right.
They're looking for a uniform, they're looking for a flag, they're looking for a
Totally.
to attach themselves to.
Exactly, that's right.
And that's always a little. Really, the idea is not to become a something, but to engage in a practice that positively impacts your life.
Your life, exactly.
Whether that's a reduction of suffering or whether that's an increase in happiness or both, and
Right.
however one defines those. I wanted to touch on another subject.
Sure.
And we're going on this here is we associate a great deal in the West with meditation. There's a great deal of focus on meditation, and part of that comes from the strength of Zen in our culture.
Right.
A lot of it comes in studies with MBSR,
Yeah,
Kabat-Zinn,
right.
mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Yeah.
It's all based on meditation, and I wonder if there's a risk in that view of meditation just becoming another, here's how you feel happier or reduce suffering, or it's stress control, and certainly there are those benefits.
Right.
But I wonder if there is a risk, and I think so, with having a focus just on meditation when there's maybe a bit more to that spiritual tradition of Buddhism, that what we would call in traditional context the Eightfold Path. That's they shy away from it because it comes from a religious tradition, and without investigating it and saying, no, this is actually a very pragmatic approach.
Right. That's right.
It's more
Right.
than just meditation. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Good. Okay. So yeah, so I do have thoughts on that, and so let's sort of get right into So one of the reasons when I wrote the book, I mean, I had become such a student of Buddhist philosophy without becoming a Buddhist, by the way. And partly my resistance to calling myself that was that I realized in America there's sort of this Marin, California way of being a Buddhist that really gives me the heebie-jeebies. And but I do in the book, as you know, think that Buddhist philosophy minus what I call the hocus pocus, and of course I do that to be provocative, and where by hocus pocus I mean the beliefs that, as you would put it as a skeptic, when people come to me and try to explain why they believe these things, I don't see any evidence for them. And that's not to be disrespectful of anyone. It's really just that, again, going back to my own philosophical orientation, if one comes up in the sort of epistemological traditions that I did, then I need a certain kind of evidence. And I could be wrong in demanding that evidence, of course, but I want to see a certain kind of evidence. And and many of these beliefs are 2,500 years old, and we need to, what I call, naturalize them, sort of bring them up to date and see what we can believe. So my overall view is that one of the reasons that I really get why Buddhism is so attractive to Western secularists or secular humanists or scientifically oriented people is because it does without certain props. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, certain theories that some people in the West, like the one about you need a God to support morality, have often thought of. So I think here we've got morally serious people, all over 500 million of them or so in the world, who are Buddhists, who are morally serious and don't have a creator God who judges them at the end of their life. Now they have a karmic reward system, so that so what I try to do in the book is look at Buddhist metaphysics, Buddhist epistemology, and Buddhist ethics, and talk about what can you subtract and still have a legitimate something or other you call Buddhism, and in particular those beliefs in karma and rebirth and things like that. And I claim that you can do it, and some people are already doing it, people like your community, and so on and so forth. So it exists. Whatever is actual is already, whatever is possible, whatever is actual is possible. So you guys are the possibility proof. And so I try to draw out that sort of picture in the book. One of the reasons, of course, to do that is because now one might say, well, you make Buddhism sound too intellectual, and of course that's because I'm a philosopher. But I really do try to say, here's what is something like a core of Buddhist beliefs, if you were going to say that there is something like Buddhist philosophy that you could. And of course, something like Pure Land and Zen and things like that, traditions wouldn't sort of articulate it in the same way I do, and I'm quite aware of that. But I'm doing something which is sort of some kind of amalgamation of what you might call like an ideal type of what Buddhist philosophy would be if you had to articulate it in front of, classes of students over a period of time. And I think it's a deep and rich and very plausible philosophy about the impermanence of everything. The world, we would call it a process philosophy about everything being in flux and in change. And the idea that there's no rebirth, of course, is something that was there in a lot of Theravadan Buddhist traditions. The idea of afterlives was metaphorical, perhaps. So that's sort of the project as I see it in the book. As far as the thing about meditation, and it is true, and I was actually kind of surprised to find this out. So just as you said, of course, Zen may be the most meditative of all the Buddhisms. George Dreyfus, in his wonderful book, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, and he was in these Tibetan monasteries that are the size of Ohio states. He says that there's a lot of yelling, there's a lot of soccer playing, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of memorizing text, and there's almost no meditation in these big Tibetan monasteries. When I've been in Thailand, I ask people, do you meditate? Almost no one meditates. Monks meditate, of course, but ordinary lay people don't meditate. So that was always kind of interesting to me, and that was another reason that I focused on the features of Buddhism which go beyond or are different from the distinctively meditative practices in the book. As far as the therapeutic side of things, this is again another interesting question. So I remember I was in graduate school when I think it was Herbert Benson's book came out called The Relaxation Response. That was one of the first attempts to take any kind of meditation practice and just say, look, it's good for your heart. And then Kabat-Zinn, of course, has tried to de-Buddhicize mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that's fine. And I think what we do know is that these things are very good for your health and overall well-being, anxiety reduction, improving immune response, and so on and so forth. One of the things I try to emphasize in the book, though, is that those good effects are different from becoming a good person or becoming a happy person.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and you make that point very well. And one of the things I admire most about the book is that you are a philosopher, you're at Duke, and so there's writing in here which is as dense as poetry because it has that philosophical, intellectual approach. And yet, at the same time, interspersed with that, you have just the regular, plain old conversation that people also find very engaging. Use of terms like hocus pocus, things like that.
Right.
You do spell it out quite plainly as well. So that's one of the really nice things about the book is that if you approach this with as a reader and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be thick philosophy. Yes, that's in there, but don't let that stop you because that's not the entire content of the book. There's a very valid and meaningful points that we've been talking about today in the podcast that are really addressed and expanded in this.
Well, thank you very much.
Very nicely done. Well, Owen, what else would you like to chat about while we're talking?
Well, I guess, I'm interested in actually you telling me more about how big do you think this your skeptical secular community is right now?
That's an excellent question. And in fact, I just had this past weekend a discussion with a friend, Julian Adkins in Scotland, who'd first been introduced to me through the auspices of Stephen Batchelor. So, Stephen, thank you for doing that. And he is becoming involved in a couple of different groups are starting their own practice communities. And they're as these communities typically start, as many Western Zen centers started, just meeting at somebody's house and starting some classes and maybe as an adjunct to an existing center. I'm seeing that crop up all over the world, and I'm getting emails from people saying, "Hey, how are there people in the UK? Are there people in these different locations?" And I've set up on the website under resources a practice centers page. Mm-hmm. There are starting to be groups that are identifying as secular Buddhists. There's outright saying that's what we are, and some have backed away from that a little bit because it's put off the more traditional people who really are very pragmatic and secular. That's a tough word for them to wrap around because it has some baggage to it.
Right. I mean, the word secular, you're saying that's yes. The word that's hard. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a challenge for some people because they think, as many people think that atheist means against Christians. My roommate, coworker said, "Oh, that's what that means," and I'm like, no, it really doesn't.
Right, that's right. Yeah,
secular doesn't mean antagonistic towards religion. It has a very specific meaning, which again, Stephen Batchelor goes into quite beautifully in his retreats and talks on secular Dharma. That it really means, in this lifetime, in the natural world, what you and I would look at as a naturalistic view.
Right, that's right.
And it's not to say that the ideas of karma are invalid. They are valid. We just need to change maybe how we take them as not being a cosmic, magical gear and pulley system. If you do this, then something does happen to you, and there's a magic check and balance system. But that, and this was a conversation I was having with Dan Siegel a few episodes ago. He brought up quite nicely that, yes, there are things that occur in the brain that then manifest in how you behave, the way you act, the way you treat others. And those will have impacts long past your own death. And so that fits in quite well with karma, that there are I like the Zen ideas of the ripples in the ocean. You drop a pebble in a pond, right. Ripples are going to continue well past that. And that's what we see, and that's a very natural, nothing supernatural about that. If I raise my child in a very positive way, they're probably going to turn out a little bit differently than if I am an abusive parent. Exactly. We see that tendency. It doesn't mean that it's nailed down and it's absolutely going to turn out the same way every time. We're far more complex than that, and that we need to bear that in mind. People are complicated creatures.
Well, it's exactly like that Aristotelian idea that you can't tell about the quality. You might say you can't tell whether a person's life was happy, meaningful, or significant, or the degree to which until you see how the grandkids turn out. And that's just a metaphor for the karmic effects that we leave. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I do distinguish in the book. This is one of my subscripting things that probably is annoying but between what I call a tame conception of karma, which is perfectly plausible, that what goes around comes around, and that our actions leave effects on both us and other people, even if we're not caught out in doing bad things, they are leaving effects on ourselves and the world around us. And this is a perfectly understandable from every world tradition that there is such a thing. The what I call untamed karma is just a particular metaphysical view that the details of which were worked out and is possible and is about as plausible as a creator God who rewards and punishes after you die, and therefore is not that credible at all. Is the upshot, I think. But it's not. It's a good try.
Yeah.
It's not a crazy idea. It's one of those that people hit upon again and again over the course of human history, and we have explanations for why they would do that. But it's not as if we have to give up the whole theory at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you ever run into, when you're having discussions about things pertaining to the ideas of evidence, say of things like rebirth and all of that, do you ever have difficulty explaining that stories, which are very interesting and sound cool, are nonetheless not evidence?
Yeah, this is something as a professional philosopher. This is maybe, I mean, either I'm getting older or, but I've gotten calmer about it. I mean, just giving, yes. So because one of the four sub areas of philosophy is epistemology / logic, we confront this day in and day out that, we try to teach at universities, we have logic, epistemology, statistics, probability theory, all kinds of ways of trying to teach proper evidence gathering and reasoning. And here's a good example. So you teach a course in which you give the students the arguments for the existence of God. And then you go through them and you show them, and they can become to see that each and every classical argument for the existence of an Abrahamic God doesn't work as a logical argument. It just doesn't work. They all don't work. No one who knows how to do logic misses this. Nonetheless, it has almost no effect on whether or not students will continue to believe and prefer one argument over the other as the reason for their belief, even though they can come to understand that the arguments don't provide evidence. So I've come to think that humans just have these psychological dispositions to believe what we believe, and it's important to be able to ask for evidence, but one can't count even on the best people to stick by the standards of logic. And I think that's just one of those things, and that's where I do think a kind of compassion and tolerance for people. You sometimes have to bring them up short and say, look, you're now trying to push some kind of public policy or change other people's behavior based on this belief. Now you need to stop, because remember that part about you don't have the evidence for that belief? They say, oh yeah, now I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not to say that the experiences we have, say, in meditation are not incredibly inspiring and transformative. They certainly can be, and many of us listening have had these kinds of experiences during meditation or during spiritual retreats and in other traditions, and that's fine. We're not saying that can't be meaningful to you. What we are saying is that the conclusions we draw about the actuality of those things which occur to us, that might be something for us to question, because we see that different traditions will have different explanations and they're conflicting. So it's how do we distinguish what is really so, and often we don't need to. Does it work for you? Yes. Cool.
That's right.
Go with it.
Right. Yeah. I was actually last month. I was in the Amazon with people called the Ashwar, Achuar. The Ashwar only came in contact with Westerners in the 1980s, and they're dream people, and they take a lot of hallucinogens. And there's a ritual. It's a little bit like confirmation or a bar mitzvah or a bas mitzvah. When you're coming of age, you take this very strong hallucinogen. The kids do it, called what's it called? Well, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's I want to say Ayaskawa or something like that, but I'm forgetting. Anyway, they drink it and then they have hallucinations, and the people believe that the hallucinations will tell the child what his future will be, in the sense of really what kind of job he'll be, whether he'll be a shaman or a father or a mother or, you get it. There's like 4 or 5 social roles. Anyway, this is a very powerful, ritualistic, you get sick and you vomit, but you have visual hallucinations. And that's a beautiful, everybody talks about this with real, it's a beautiful cultural ceremony. And do I believe that they see their future? Well, in one sense I do, because it's like training for a bar mitzvah. You're told you have to memorize the text. You're brought up in a culture which has these 4 or 5 roles. You're encouraged to have certain kind of visions. So in one sense, it works exactly as they say. And that's the kind of thing to be respectful of. All cultures have those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, including our own. Baseball.
Our own.
We got to... Well, we've been speaking with Owen Flanagan. All of the books that we've mentioned here can be found on the episode page for this episode. Owen, thank you so much. This has been terrific. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Super, Ted. Thank you so much for getting up so early, wherever you are. Are you on the West Coast or Central
Minneapolis,
time?
Yep.
Minneapolis. Well, thanks. Really appreciate this, and it was a great pleasure, and I wish all the best to you and your audience.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.